And again, like there's so much that everyone, has been speculating about. And as someone, who, is an aspiring historian who likes to adheres to the nature of the discipline and the tenets of it and all, I'm always inclined to, we need to have some actual factual basis for what we're discussing in order to present a thesis and then our analysis therein. But I mean, at any rate, whatever we do or do not know with Epstein, it's undeniable that he was running a child sex trafficking ring and that the federal government had knowledge of it, as well as many state governments and local governments, as well as the police forces of all those different echelons. I mean, he was already tried and convicted as a pedophile. And so the fact that he was able to reassimilate back into high society is as condemning as anything else with regards to him. And it's so frustrating because, it's clear that, we're all trying to figure this out. And I think a lot of people are motivated by the feeling of, wanting to see justice for the victims. And that's what it should come down to, is centering the struggles and the horrible situation that the victims had to undergo. And I want to say, when you read about this case and when you study it and you do your own research, you need to be very careful that it doesn't become something of a voyeuristic impulse. We need to be very committed to wanting to see justice meted out. But again, as I said, we got to maintain a handle on our critical faculties. And I brought along for this episode another excerpt from a very important, almost forgotten essay in my mind. There was this figure. He was a German Jewish Marxist theorist who was associated with the Frankfurt School for some time. And he wrote a lot of great studies analyzing Nazi Germany and understanding different political movements themselves, how they work. His name was Franz Neumann. And he died actually quite young at the age of 54. And he wrote primarily in German. But in 1957, as part of his book, The Democratic and the Authoritarian State, there was this essay in it by the name of Anxiety in Politics. And in that, he talks about the conspiracy theory of history. And so I bring this up because when we discuss these cases, we don't want ourselves to start sounding like QAnon types or, these right-wing lunatics who just conjure up things completely out of or they just completely conjure up, these nonsensical notions which make no sense and they're not based. We still need to exist within reality. But the reason why conspiracy theories that take something that does truthfully happen and they get expanded into something larger is because there is a kernel of truth to them. And so on some level, you understand why some of the people who lose their mind when they study this case and they just start spouting off all these other things, you kind of recognize why this happens because there is a degree of truth to it. There's no doubt that this person, Jeffrey Epstein, was the head of a child sex trafficking ring, and the government, the federal government, and its highest agencies and echelons allowed it to persist in some capacity. And so I just want to read this excerpt from this section of the essay called Anxiety in Politics by Franz Neumann, and known as the Conspiracy Theory in History. He begins by characterizing and defining this notion of Caesaristic identification, which is just this idea of he says, Caesaristic identifications may play a role in history when the situation of masses is objectively endangered, when the masses are incapable of understanding the historical process, and when the anxiety activated by the danger becomes neurotic, persecutory, or aggressive anxiety through manipulation. From this follows, first of all, that not every situation dangerous to the masses must lead to a Caesaristic movement. It follows further that not every mass movement is based on anxiety, and thus not every mass movement need be Caesaristic. Thus, it is a question of determining the historical conditions in which a regressive mass movement under a Caesar tries to win political power. Now, I'll pause there because I think Trump fits the definition of a Caesaristic leader with the way that many of his supporters have identified with him, including the QAnon types, which lead them to then conclude that Trump isn't associated with Epstein, even though there's videos of him partying with Epstein, even though there's quite a bit of evidence that suggests they did have contact with each other. And so, rather than coming to the conclusion that figures such as Bill Clinton, that Trump, that Prince Andrew, they all have associations with Epstein. They tend to allow themselves to, stop from actually getting a holistic picture. But I want to continue again. And this is for our listeners' edification that, yes, we need to critically examine these issues, but we also need to maintain a hold on careful analysis and the reality we live in. So Neumann continues by saying, however, before we describe these historical situations, I may perhaps point to a clue which will frequently permit us an early diagnosis of the regressive character of such a mass movement. This clue is the view of history which the masses and the leaders employ. It may be called the conspiracy theory of history, a theory of history characterized by a false concreteness. The connection between Caesarism and this view of history is quite evident. Just as the masses hope for their deliverance from distress through absolute oneness with a person, so they ascribe their distress to certain persons who have brought this distress into the world through a conspiracy. The historical process is personified in this manner. Hatred, resentment, dread, created by great upheavals, are concentrated on certain persons who are denounced as devilish conspirators. Nothing would be more incorrect than to characterize the enemies as scapegoats, as often happens in the literature, for they appear as genuine enemies whom one must extirpate and not as substitutes whom one only needs to send into the wilderness. It is a false concreteness and therefore an especially dangerous view of history. Indeed, the danger consists in the fact that this view of history is never completely false, but always contains a kernel of truth and, indeed, must contain it if it is to have a convincing effect. The truer it is, one might say, the less regressive the movement. The falser, the more regressive. It is my thesis that wherever affective, in other words, Caesaristic, leader identifications occur in politics, masses and leader have this view of history, that the distress which has befallen the masses has been brought about exclusively by a conspiracy of certain persons or groups against the people. With this view of history, true anxiety, which had been produced by war, want, hunger, anarchy, is to be transformed into neurotic anxiety and is to be overcome by means of identification with the leader demagogue through total ego renunciation to the advantage of the leader and his clique, whose true interests do not necessarily have to correspond to those of the masses. And he goes on to say, of course, I cannot provide conclusive proof, but I believe that by pointing to certain historical events, I can make clear the connection between this view of history and Caesarism. Well, the moment we're living in right now, Trump's class interests are clearly diametrically opposed to the majority of the Americans, and yet he does have a sizable minority contingent of them who are very supportive of him. So Trump could be a wealthy businessman who was given everything in life, and yet those who support him might not have that same class background at all, and yet they believe that he's acting in their interest. On the same token, Trump can have direct ties to Epstein, which suggests, and through other accusations against him, that he is a unsavory sexual predator and sexual abuser, and yet those who support him could choose not to look at that and identify with what he presents to be his own truth and reality. So again, I leave you with this Neumann piece and in our discussion, how brief it might be on the Epstein case, to say it's a burning story that's going to be talked about in the coming days for a long time, but we need to make sure that we're not doing the work of the ruling class by obfuscating the reality, by turning against each other and getting so wrapped around the axle that we're actually missing what's happening in terms of, this case's connection to this capitalist epoch, we're living in, and this national government and its policy agenda.
People, I think that the fact that Epstein has died, that there's still victims that are alive. And I mean, the fact that he was killed or whatever happened, that doesn't mean that this case should be forgotten about or just remembered in the sense of like how crazy of a story it is and like who's going to make the first documentary about it and all that stuff. Like there's people who need justice, right? Who, Jeffrey Epstein died and left behind many billions of dollars. All of the women that he abused and trafficked and all of that should be entitled to all of those billions of dollars. And all of the people that were involved in the protection operation, including in our own government, the people that told Acosta, the judge that gave Epstein, house arrest for being convicted for raping underage girls. He was ordered by someone to give him that. Who are all these people, and how do we hold them accountable? Like just the fact that Epstein's gone, doesn't mean shit. And I mean, I think that's one of the, as you were mentioned earlier, Spencer, about the kind of the loss of the focus on victims and the focus on just how crazy this case is. I mean, that's been one of the hard things about the Me Too movement is it's successful when you could focus it on a powerful person, where then the story becomes about that person, unless they're too powerful where they don't get taken down by it, like Joe Biden, like Woody Allen, very credible sexual assault claims have come out about them, but sometimes you're too big to fail if you're accused of the Me Too stuff. And I think one of the important things that was done to try to break through that was the Unite Here union. Unite Here is an amazing nationwide union that represents workers, particularly in the hotel industry. And many don't remember when the Me Too movement started and there was this new public consciousness about assault. And, of course, it targeted powerful men in Hollywood. Unite Here launched this campaign that was like, women who clean hotel rooms are sexually assaulted at a really insane rate by hotel guests, by hotel executives and things like that. And they tried to give that movement this kind of working class component. And in fact, the most vulnerable workers, mostly immigrant women who working in cleaning these hotel rooms, making very low wages. And it was never able to be picked up on because there weren't these like enemy figures that were able to be focused on. And so, I think the Epstein thing is just another example of that. There's so many people who are left in the wake of this. And now that the person we can focus on as the villain is gone, it ignores that entire apparatus, like in the case of the Unite Here campaign, the entire apparatus and infrastructure that allows that to happen. How women at work couldn't report the sexual assaults. Nothing would happen to the guests. Nothing would happen to the boss of the hotel. All of these things. There's an infrastructure and a network, and that's inherent to patriarchy and capitalism, that there's these structures that exist where you can't even really break through in a legal way to be able to get accountability.
Yeah. And again, at the end of the day, it's completely, bonkers. It's bananas when you see this guy who's, on suicide watch, and six days later he's found dead. I mean, there's the issue with the cop from Westchester County who somehow had access. I mean, it just is, it's almost like, it's so insane in such a way that it benefits those in power because it makes you lose your mind trying to grapple with it all. But again, at the end of the day, the goal of all of this should see justice given to the victims who had to suffer at the hands of this guy and all of his associates, like Maxwell, who's out there still. Les Wexner, who's most likely the person who gave Epstein his starting position or helped stand him up as a figure in high society. I mean, he's the one who gave him the mansion on the Upper East Side for free. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, all of these figures, and again, the political leaders we've already mentioned, anyone who is in some way attached or beholden to the ruling class, in this like capitalist society, of course, one should be suspicious of them just in general, but especially when you see the details of this case. But again, keep a grip on things. We're all united in trying to fight for a better world, but let's not allow ourselves to turn into the parodies, the self-parodies that the QAnon types and others like them are.